Welcome to my sister Béa, who's back on the channel to talk about astrological ages, precession, and a number of other things that relate to astrology and other factors as well.
Hey, thanks for having me back. This is my actual, my favorite subject of all, because I'm able to tie with this history, which is my academic background, storytelling, which is what I do, and my real love of astrological cycles. Obviously, I created an organization called Sophia Cycles. So the whole concept of a cycle is a big deal for me. I'm going to promise to try to speak slowly this time.
There's so many people that love it when you speak really
I know.
fast.
Well, I push. Well, one thing is you will know that I will try, but invariably I will speed up because I get excited and and that's what happens. But you can always give me a signal, Andre, to say,
yeah,
okay,
we need a safe word or a safe. Yeah, exactly. Okay.
Yeah. So anyway, I will do my best. I promise. So I'm going to, if you let me share the screen, and I will, then we'll start with this because I put it together so I can sort of guide myself. Okay. So can you see, hold on.
Yes.
You can see my screen here. Okay, so I want to start. Obviously, everybody in your group should know by now that I'm very much taken with Jung's work. That's my fundamental, my big interest is Jung, and anybody related to his thinking, like von Franz, etc. So Jung, remember during our last talk, we talked about how Jung had a heart attack in his late 60s. And prior to that, he was a little bit wary about speaking about things related to the occult or the unseen, or a whole bunch of things that were considered way too much outside of the academic sphere. As it was, Jung was already rejected by the academia or by academics. So he wasn't going to fit in anyway, but he was really not going to go this far. But then when he had his heart attack, he went on to write in his 70s, probably his most important works. And one of them was Aion. And Aion, of course, means the age. Right away, sorry for clinking here. I'm just arranging the my window here. Okay, so he says here, before my illness, I'd often ask myself if I were permitted to publish or even speak of my secret knowledge. I later set it all down in Aion. And in Aion, I've noted before, because I think it's hysterical, if you talk to Jung scholars, they will try to skip over the fact that in Aion, he mentions the astrological ages. And this embarrasses them. But I think there's another theory I'm going to have. I'm going to put it out to you. The astrological ages, the whole astrological symbolic world is extremely difficult. Jung had a grasp of it. He studied with Alan Leo, or he studied Alan Leo's texts. He really understood it. But most people coming to this don't understand it. So what I find they do is they bleep over it. They just say, well, that's nonsense. So let's just move over it. But he was trying to make a very important point, which is why I thought it would be really important to look at it and what he was trying to say. So if anybody is as keen as I am and is much into Jung as I am, there's actually a book called Aion, which they can look at this. And there's also part of the collected works. It's volume 9, part 2, just in case there's anybody out there who likes this, because I note that sometimes people comment that they're really happy that I give them the book references. I will also say that I'm going to be mentioning quite a few things, and I'm going to give you the links afterwards, and maybe you can put them below the YouTube videos so that people can know. Okay, so this I got from YouTube. I don't know if it's going to work, but I think people really have to understand precession, and they have to understand what went down here. There is another reason to understand this. Every once in a while, the New York Times, and they don't do this anymore, would publish some derogatory piece dismissing astrologers because they were so stupid that they didn't realize that what's in the sky, right, does not match our symbolic system, that it's 20 to 3 degrees off. This is just absolute craziness, because what idiot would study this the way we study it and not understand that this sidereal map does not map our symbolic system? The reason it doesn't is that Western astrology, Hellenistic astrology, is based on the tropical system, which is based on the seasons and not on the stars up there. So let me explain to people. If you, like me, have a sun at 6 degrees Capricorn, you will not find it in the sky at 6 degrees Capricorn. You will find it 23 degrees earlier because of something I'm going to explain to you, which is precession. And the reason you want to know this is you are going to get hit with this by Neil deGrasse Tyson and all of these know-it-alls who don't even bother looking at their own history. Because remember that astronomy, the history, astrology and astronomers, astrologers and astronomers, they were the same people, right? Newton, even Kepler, as far as Kepler, and way beyond that, before that. So it's ignorance on their part. And I think it's ignorance because when you don't know something, and because it's depreciated by the culture and the culture looks at it as silly, people don't really understand how complicated and how complex, and how maybe the people that are studying it really do understand that we're not mapping the same thing. So somebody created a really good YouTube video, and I'm going to try to run just this part, and then I will give people the link, and you can put it there so people can go to this if they want to look at it. Okay. The thing to know about precession and how this is all mapped, and to understand the astrological ages, you do need to know this, is that the Earth is on an axis, right? 23-degree axis. And so it's spinning like this, and then it's going around. And I'm just going to move this to hopefully to a place where you can make sense. Can you see it? Okay, so here's the Earth spinning, right? There it's going on its axis. And now one cycle to go right around takes 26,000 years. I'm going to stop this and explain why is there an Aries sign at one end. That is because, all right, the way it's mapped is the vernal equinox, which happens the first day of spring. This is what we imagine, the day that when you look up at the sky, that at 0 degrees point is whatever the first, it maps to whatever the first day of spring is, right? And it maps in the sky. I hope I'm explaining this properly. Jump in if I'm not, because I find that sometimes it's hard to explain. That's when we start counting. In other words, it's not what's in the sky itself, but where that point, what marker point is, which changes to the tune of 1 degree every 72 years.
Right. So just jumping in really quickly.
Yeah, explain.
Well, so the idea is like this whole controversy exists because of trying to do astrology through the constellations, and the idea that there's some constellation that looks like the head of a ram, and we'll call that Aries, and then there's the one that looks like something to do with a bull, and we'll call that Taurus, and so forth. So you're taking sections of the sky and you're saying, okay, there it is. But then the problem is the sky is in constant motion. And then what starts to happen is, yes, way back when, 0 Aries was lined up with whatever they're saying is that, which by the way, already is a pretty big reach to say, well, we're just going to call that section there the head of the whatever. Right. So then they say that's Aries, but then that place moves back, exactly as you say, a degree every 72 years. So then you can imagine that if 1,000 years pass, you get a pretty big discrepancy, right? So right now we're in a place where the 0 Aries, the spring point, as measured by the tropical system, which is always the same every year, and this would be about maybe 5 degrees Pisces, like way back. You have to pull back 25 degrees. And so that's it. But the thing about it is, I'll say something really quickly here, because this is critical around Neil deGrasse Tyson and this type of thinking. You can do amazingly clear astrology without ever looking at signs. You can just track planets, and you have to be really dense, thick as 2 planks, to not notice when planets move and affect your original planets, that an effect is created that is palpable. It's in your feeling and including in events. You don't have to get into the signs. The signs add something fantastic on top, but it's unnecessary. And as to why they work really, really well in the tropical system, better, in fact, than the so-called constellational system, I can't answer that other than to say that maybe it's because this is our backyard. We're here, right? So it makes sense that seasonally, would be a really good model, rather than worrying about, this kind of thing. You're talking thousands of light years away. You're going way out there to say that stuff out there, really, really far away, is what connects to me. I'm a little bit skeptical. So Well,
and so let's just play this quickly so people can see, because when it comes to the astrological ages, you do need to know how this works so you can understand what they were referring to. Just on one level of a synchronicity, which is beyond belief, when the Hellenistic astrologers conceptualized this whole system, which was probably around the 3rd century BCE, they were aligned. That's the one time they were aligned. So 0 degrees Aries was aligned with that exact point at 0 degrees. So both systems, but they were aware that they would not be aligned forever. They had figured this out. So the fact that Neil deGrasse Tyson now talks about them not knowing, when Hipparchus figured this out before, is insane. Okay, let's just run this so people can understand what's going on. So here's this belt and it's going across, right? So now it's going to slow down. And here's the 1000 BC. These are now the periods of time. They're about 2,100 years long, each of them, right? And here they go. And Aquarius, it says 2000 AD, but the general belief is that it's more like 2160. And this is what you were just talking about, Andre. Constellations don't have demarcations, clear demarcations. Oh, now we're moving on to Capricorn. Right. They all overlap, right? So to actually know. So here's Jung's incredible, brilliant genius. He was really concerned with one thing that does match the astrological ages. He was concerned with the changing of the God image, right? And he realized that every time, if you go back in history, the God image changes. Now, he understood God to be something that's within, that's projected onto the sky, that's projected onto whatever you want to project to at any given time. And that becomes your God, right? It's always within, but it's being projected outside. If the symbol set, the symbol system changes and it corresponds to whatever constellation is going out there, it raises a lot of questions. It raises a lot of questions about what kind of model of reality are we even living in? But if you look historically, it seems that the types of gods you were getting, and I'm going to do a little quick history for people, not too in depth, and I will tell them where they can look at this more in depth if they would like. You get a sense that something is going on. And I think the reason this appeals to me personally, may appeal to you for a different reason, is that it just animates the universe in a way that nothing else does. It just makes things seem like, and it's not about, by the way, it's not cause and effect. It's not that something is affecting, that planet is affecting you as you walk around. It is almost like there is a synchronicity at work where things are enmeshed. We're part of this wave, and this is all manifesting on that level. Now, let me go on. I'm just gonna. I will give the link to this so people can look at this more carefully if they're interested. Let me see if I can go to the next one. So here's Hipparchus, and this is why I kind of laugh at this whole thing. He had already figured out that there was such a thing as precession. He knew it was 1 degree about 72 years. Quite amazing, if you think about it, that he could calculate this at the time that he was living with the tools he had available. But I think one thing we do, because I'm in love with the ancients, is we really underestimate how much the ancients actually knew. And I'm going to put something else out there. My interest in astrology is not really in predictive astrology or any of that. I'm really interested in it as the mother mythology. I've said this before, astrology is the mother mythology. Why? Because since the beginning of time, people have been looking at the stars and trying to figure out where they fit. And if you really want to track this, you read this book. It's called The Human Cosmos, Civilization, and the Stars. She points out that, and this is a history of science book, it has nothing to do with astrology, although of course she actually is quite knowledgeable and is able to look at it without becoming ridiculous about it, understands it. She points out that Hipparchus actually wasn't the first person. The Babylonians had already figured out precession. This is quite amazing if you think about it, okay? Mm-hmm. She also points out, and this is why I recommend this book, that the cave drawings that you see are actually astronomical drawings. They have nothing to do with what you think they do. So anyway, highly recommend this book if anybody's really interested in this kind of story. Now, if you are interested in grand cycles, of course, Cosmos and Psyche by Richard Tarnas. I've mentioned this before. He's an absolute genius because he's an intellectual historian who understands a lot, right? And then also is able to put together with the cycles. He claimed that his first book that he wrote, which is still a text that is used in a lot of the universities, he wrote so that he could match it with all of the cycles he was seeing in the sky. And he felt he had to know the intellectual history before he actually mapped it. So Cosmos and Psyche, not an easy book, but a very, very worthwhile book. The other one is Signs of the Times by Robert Fitzgerald. He actually takes you through each of the ages in a very detailed manner. Okay. It's fantastic, but I do not like the subtitle of that book, because if you can read it, it says the end of the world and the coming golden age. There is no coming golden age. This is one of the things that drives me absolutely crazy. How could you believe, think about this one, if you know your astrology pretty well, that an age governed by the traditional planet, which is Saturn, could possibly be golden? You might be having a hard time there. And in fact, he then contradicts himself, because he gives you areas which are fascinating and which will tell you a lot about why I think that subtitle makes no sense. But in terms of tracking, I think he does a great job. So here, let's look at a general about these kinds of God images and how they changed. Okay, so you have from 4300 BC, I'm just going to look at Taurus, Aries, very, very over the top, and Pisces as well, just to give you a sense of how the God image itself is changing, okay? Because what he's arguing, what Jung is arguing is when you get a shift in the God age, okay, God dies. The God that we know dies, and you have to reconceptualize God, and you go through a period of great dislocation. Why do you think he was writing that? He was living through that age in his own time. Nietzsche had announced the death of God in the late 19th century, and then you get to the point where he's living in an age before anything is reconceptualized, and he kept saying we need a new myth, and we don't have one. Can you just take a pause right now, Andre? Can you pause it just for a second? I have to actually close the door. My dog has walked in. Open the door, and we're gonna pick up a lot of noise.
Yes, I'll pause
so
it.
If you could just pause it, thank you. All right. So just getting back to the ages, right? These are very broad. It didn't happen that at 2150 BC you suddenly changed to Aries, because again, the constellations overlap. But let's look at the God image, because that's what's really fascinating about this. So in the Age of Taurus, you have societies where the bull is very, very big. One of them right here represented is Crete, Minoan. Interesting thing, the bullfight in its original conceptualization came from this period. Now, one thing that's really interesting, and I think you will know this, polarity is very important in signs. Mm-hmm. So when you have the age of Taurus, you also have the Scorpio archetype coming in at the same time. So bulls being killed in a bull ring bring in both the Venus and the Taurus and the Scorpio story, right?
Right.
Also, by the way, just for those who are interested, this was a ritualized, in its inception, it was a ritualized way for the female was the toreador, the matador, and the bull was the male, and it was a way for the feminine to conquer the masculine. This is the original conceptualization, which, if you think about it, that's the Venus-Mars polarity that Taurus and Scorpio represent, right? Venus mm-hmm. being Taurus. And Venus, by the way, in Taurus, unlike the Libra, which we'll talk about later, is much earthier and sensual. And so one of the things you see in the Taurus section is the Jungians, the specific Jungian that did a lot of talks on animals. And the cat is always associated with the feminine, all right? And the cat, to me, is a Taurus creature, not a Leo creature. That's more the big cats. But the domestic cat is a very Taurian kind of Venus creature, kind of relates to what it wants to. It's sensual. It has this kind of really super feminine. The Jungians always believe the dog had more of the fat masculine, make that what you want of it. But the cat really seems to have that, right? So what's interesting about it is in the culture of the Taurus period, the Egyptians revered cats. They'd be temple cats. They'd be everywhere, which is not the case for once you get into Aries period. And we'll talk about that later. So what other things came up in that Taurus Scorpio period? Interesting. Written language begins here. But how did it begin? You think that's a Gemini thing, right? The reason language begins, we saw this documentary once, which is fascinating about the evolution of writing, was because they had to record financial transactions, right? Which is very Venus's Taurus as well.
Taurus,
they had to, yes, they had to record. Right. And so because trade was beginning, which is also kind of a Taurian thing, but they had to record it. So that gave them the impetus, which would later be developed into a much more broader thing. And that, by the way, is not only in ancient Sumeria, it actually also happens in other areas of the world. One of the things that Fitzgerald does very, very well, I think, is he doesn't limit it to Western examples. He has examples from across the world. Because if you think of an age, if it only applies to the West, it makes absolutely no sense, right? But he has great examples from China. He has great examples from the New World. Now, when you go to the Age of Taurus, that's a long time ago. We don't have that many records or such clear recorded records. So you're kind of guessing, but you know the iconography because it shows up in temples. It shows up in places where you can track it. Okay. Right. Now, at the height of the Age of Taurus, Joseph Campbell, one of my favorite thinkers, points out that the bull god, right, the dead and resurrected bull god, now think about Taurus, was supreme everywhere. Okay. And in the old kingdom of Egypt, Osiris, which is their major myth, was also represented by a bull. So this is what was in the air, which then subsequently changes. By the way, for anybody who's interested, I didn't list this here. Osiris, the great myth that belongs to the Egyptian age, gets recycled and becomes the Christian myth under the Pisces age, because what you will see is a recycling of the same mythologies, but with different. And this is what made this so interesting to Jung. He said, my God, it's the same thing being recycled and being retold, but you're looking at the same archetypes being formed over and over again. So here's another representation of the bull. There's the Eye of Horus. This is what the iconography of the time. Now we get to the age of Aries, right? Which is ruled by Mars, right? And we get to a much more martial period of time. Remember, well, not surprising, right? We're bringing in the polarity, though, of Libra, because remember that Aries and Libra work together. There's the same, they're across each other. So again, we have Mars, Venus, but we have a very different Mars, Venus right now, right? This is the masculine Mars, unlike the Scorpio Mars, which is the feminine Mars. And this Venus is the masculine Venus, because that's the Libra Venus. The way I always tell people, remember it, is this Venus is the one that comes out of Zeus's head, fully armored, Athena, Venus Athena. She comes out with her full armor. So it's a female deity, but it's not really a traditional female deity. So the thing that's interesting, we've talked about this before, is the big document of the age, the important book of the age. It was not a book, but the story is based on the Trojan War, which purportedly happened in this age around 1200 BCE, and we get the Iliad. And all of the values that are in the Iliad are extremely martial. Think about something about the best warrior and dignity and honor and all the things that we associate with Mars and Aries. The warrior at its height. What's interesting about it is this was not only, and he does a great job of tracking this, Fitzgerald does, it doesn't all work only in the West. There is an increase generally in just the amount of conflict that exists and the idea that you have to conquer. And the Greek city-states were particularly good. That's more of my area of knowledge, in that they were competing all the time and at war with each other. And basically they exemplify that whole conquest that belongs to that Mars energy. Okay. The other thing about it, though, and we want to bring it in, he says, look, about 2/3 of the way into the age, you start getting a feeling for what's coming in the next stage. There seems to be, it gives you a glimpse, and something really interesting happens at about 570. And I want to point to something that happens in the sky that is happening at the same time, synchronous with this, which is quite amazing. So this is what Karl Jaspers, the German philosopher, called the Axial Age, okay? And the Axial Age, at the same time, over a period, now he stretches out to 500 years, but it's really concentrated over a couple hundred years. You get the explosion of practically every religious system that would then evolve from there. It's like a tree, right? And imagine that at the same time, you get the archaic period, you get the philosophy, you get math, you get all the things that were developed in Greece. You get at the same time Buddhism, Confucianism, Hinduism. It's like a huge explosion of ideas that just came out. And Karl Jaspers called it famously, this is this age where somehow something happened in human consciousness that spun this all out. Here's what's really interesting from an astrological point of view. 570, all right, you get something, oops, I'm going ahead of myself about here, but 570, you also get the only alignment that will be in the sky until 3700. Okay. And that is, you get an alignment in Taurus, get this, of Pluto, Neptune, Uranus, all three together. You will not see that alignment again until 3700, 3740. I can't give you the exact. So that is how extraordinary this period was. Is there a synchronicity? Is there a coincidence? Does it mean anything? I don't know, but I think it's quite interesting that at the same time, you get this incredible explosion of human creativity, consciousness, whatever you want to call it. You have this incredible alignment that you only see every 4,000 years or so, or more, 4,000 plus, right? So here you're looking at Moses with horns, and you're wondering, why am I looking at that? Okay, the religion in the West that is associated with Ram, the Ram, is Judaism, okay? And what's interesting about that is that, do you remember I mentioned Michael Molnar? He's this Rutgers astronomer who figured out what the Magi were looking for when they were looking for the Star of Bethlehem.
I think so. You mentioned.
Yeah, I remember I mentioned it. Well, he figured out that he said, look, Judea was always ruled by Aries. The Hellenistic astrologer said that it was an Aries ruled place, right? And there are a whole bunch of mentions that would point to the fact that the Ram was very important in this whole philosophy. So you get this incredible, actually, you see it in real life. It's amazing. So I was in Rome in 2019, and this is the first thing I wanted to see. I wanted to see Moses with horns. Moses, of course, is the big figure of Judaism. He comes down with a tablet. Why does he have horns? Right? Okay. So the official line right? By the way, this is Michelangelo's last sculpture, mid 16th century. Quite an amazing site, like I said. 15th century, I'm trying to remember the date. Anyway, his last work. The reason it has horns, according to what you read, is Saint Jerome, all right, who translated the Bible in the 5th century, who's, by the way, a repressed, horrible human being who, had so many issues that when you look at the translation, you think, I don't know how much of that ended up. Anyway, he translated the Bible from the Greek to the Latin, right? And when he got to the point about Moses, he said, and Moses, who had horns, it was generally ascribed to a transcription error because he had gone back to the Hebrew. And in Hebrew, there was a word that meant adorned one and that looked like horns. So he put horns in. That was the thing that they came up later, like in the 1700s or whatever. They decided, well, this was definitely an error on his part. But maybe it wasn't an error. Maybe what he was doing is they understood already that this belonged to a different age, because isn't it weird that it comes off with horns, which is something you associate with Aries? I mean, it's just weird, right?
Well, I mean, it's pretty strange too that, I mean, if it's adorned, like, why would you, this is what it is? That doesn't seem, I mean, maybe you would put a wreath
a halo or something.
Why would you put two? I mean,
I know so the whole thing. Yeah.
It's almost like the synchronicity. Despite whatever he thinks it was, the synchronicity seems to point to the age, rather than.
That's what I would think.
Yeah, exactly.
So I just think this is interesting. If you ever go to Rome and you're able to go into the Basilica to see this, it is quite a sight. It's beautiful to begin with, but I just kept staring at it. And that's why I went. I was jet lagged. It was the first day, but I thought, I really want to see this. So that's just a little fun. So now we get to the age of Pisces, which most astrologers will put to exactly coincident with, Christ's birth, which we don't know when it was. We don't know if it was a real person. We don't know if it was an archetype, but we know that around 0 AD, zero time, we get this new way of thinking that actually doesn't take place for a while. And you have the two fishes, which are interesting, right? They're both moving in different directions. This, by the way, is from a stained glass window in the Chartres Cathedral, which has all this iconography that is so super interesting. But there you are, Pisces, we get the initiation. And, Christ is known as the fisher of men. The whole idea of fishing is very much associated with the Christ consciousness. And if you think of Pisces, right? Pisces is all about the unconscious. You go fishing into the unconscious. It rules things like poetry, because it's nebulous. It's not the language that is precise, but we have to remember polarity. It brings Virgo in, which is extremely precise. And we'll see how it brings it in very soon, because it does bring it in. So here's the fish. Okay. What Fitzgerald does, which I think is really interesting, is he then takes the 2,000-year period, the 2,100-year period, and he divides it into sections of 180 years. And I thought, okay, I'm going to go with him. I'm going to look to see if he can convince me that this works. And so I'll tell you like an example that I can remember off the top of my head, because it's a big book. During the Scorpio period, right? What would you think some things might happen during the Scorpio period? If you're going to,
within Pisces.
So what you do is you take each age, and there's 2,100 years, then you develop. So what do you think might happen? What would be a historical thing you think might happen during the Scorpio age?
Plagues.
Exactly. The Black Death. Okay, so what's interesting about the Black Death, that people, okay, here's my historical demography geekness coming out, but what's really interesting about the Black Death, which happened mid-14th century, is that it basically eliminated a third of the body. It was a huge elimination of population. It was so radical that the serfs were liberated because there wasn't enough labor. All right. So then that's how they got the liberation, is through sheer death. It was a catastrophe. And so that happened under Scorpio. And you kind of think, okay, that kind of makes sense. Under the Capricorn age, what are some of the things we associate with Capricorn? And this might be a little more subtle, unless you know Gacquelin's work. But what are some of the things you might associate with the sub-age of Capricorn? What would you think?
Well, in Capricorn would have happened before Scorpio, because it's spinning backwards, or is he doing
No. So he's going the other way. He's going the other way. It's not precession, but procession. Okay.
So it's later. Okay. So if he's doing it, okay. So Capricorn, Capricorn is a patriarchal sign, government, styles of rule, basically.
Yes.
Because
that's exactly it. So a lot of the government structures we start taking shape under Capricorn. But the other thing that happens is a lot of our scientists are Capricorn. Remember how when Gacquelin looked at angular planets, Capricorn actually, and if you think about just off the top of your head, Newton, is Kepler? I'm not sure Kepler's, but Newton for sure. That's the first one that comes in. But there's quite a few, and it is associated with that rational organization of nature. Saturn. Yeah.
I thought that. I can't remember exactly with Gatlin, but didn't he pin it on Saturn? Or
Yes.
was he saying, because so, and that makes sense. If you think about it, Saturn is the time ruler and the planet of measurement, and scientists measure. That's how science is.
Yeah.
In order to talk about science in any way, you're measuring and you're constantly trying to get differences and make sense of all that. Whether it's chemistry, biology, it's all related to measurement.
Exactly.
You could say observation too, in the sense that Saturn is that way, but as soon as you observe, you're measuring. So yes, that makes sense. Yeah.
So that would be, if you think about the age, because I'm about to talk about what happened under Sagittarius, which happens to be an age I'm much more familiar with. But that would start 1620 and go to 1800. And what you have under that period is also the Enlightenment, right? You have that whole thinking that then cuts down alchemy. It gets rid of astrology. It gets rid of anything that cannot be categorized, quantified, made sense of in a rational way, because it threatens the status quo, which, by the way, is another good word for Saturn. So the Sagittarius era, which is 1440 to 1620, takes in the High Renaissance. And I mean, if you want to look at an incredible explosion of Sagittarian kind of happenings, this correlates so well that I thought it was amazing. So tell me some of the things you associate with Sagittarius. And by the way, there is a polarity always involved in any Gemini era. You're bringing Gemini as well. But what would you think Sagittarius with the polarity of Gemini might bring into the world? I have some of these pictures, but just off the top of your head, right?
Knowledge in a big way. Kind of Sagittarius, Gemini, that's the knowledge gathering and dissemination axis that you can take to the bank. And that's why in the modern era, you find media, advertising, and then separately teaching, it's information being moved around. Sales, often Gemini people are in sales because they're using their, to say, here, take this, and they convince you through their dialogue. So yeah, exactly. That's the way I would put it. And probably a little bit of, you might even link religion too, because Sagittarius gets into organized religion, and they're often, Sagittarius is the impulse to evangelize. And here, I know this, I'm going to teach it to you. this is the word of God type thing. That's
yes. Well, perfect. Because the first thing down on the bottom left, right here, you've got the Gutenberg press is developed at this time. So the dissemination of knowledge can happen on a larger scale. So think about Gemini writing, and then Sagittarius expands. It's ruled by Jupiter. So you get the expansion of knowledge into the hands of many. So that's one thing. You talked about religion. Well, that's the great periods, the horrible periods of the Inquisition. Why? Because you can only have one way of knowing, otherwise we will burn you at the stake. It's also the age of exploration, which is a nice way of talking about what really went down there, which was basically what crossed the ocean and eliminate entire peoples. But it's when we expanded our view of what the very world was. That's another Sagittarius concept. People went to all, and it wasn't just that they came over here. They went to, they did the circumnavigation of, it was the big era of going all over the world and figuring out and mapping where we were. The other thing that happened at the time is this is in terms of faith again. This is when Martin Luther posts his 95 Theses on the wall, which begins the Protestant Revolution and the incredible fighting that will occur post that period between Catholics and Protestants as they both try to establish which church, which way of looking at the same thing is correct. But on the cultural side, what's really amazing is just the flowering of culture, like Sagittarius. You get art, so you get the Mona Lisa, you get the work of Michelangelo we just looked at, you get Shakespeare and Cervantes. So the two biggest names really in literature in the Spanish and English language are not only writing in the same era, they purportedly died on the same day. In 1516, although when you look at the maps, there was some difference, not the maps, sorry, the actual calendars, there was some difference, but it was always the joke that the greatest mind of Spanish letters, and nothing equaled to Cervantes to this day, and Shakespeare, who is by every definition the greatest English writer, actually were writing at the same time. And finally, there's Pico de la Mirandola, right here, the Oration on the Dignity of Man. The reason this is really important is this sets the philosophical, again, philosophy, Sagittarius, the whole philosophical view of what the Renaissance was going to be about, which actually then influences right down the line. So in this particular period, I was convinced. I thought, okay, this is pretty good. This is pretty good. Like if you're looking at it, the matching is incredible. Now, you move on from that period, you go to Capricorn, and then what period we want to look at next, okay, this is we're going to look at later, was the period of the sub-period of Aquarius went from 1800 to 1980. Now let's think about what happened between 1880.
Oh yeah, that's a total
crazy,
fit.
right?
That's easy.
Like,
that's easy because that's the explosion of science, and
technology, specifically,
technology
right?
and new inventions. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
That makes
so
perfect
it works
sense.
extremely well. And then he even does a subcategory where he takes each 180 years and then breaks it down to 15 years. I'm not going to go that in depth, but I thought that the Aquarius was a particularly interesting period to look at because that gives you some idea of what the age of Aquarius might actually mean. And it's
Yeah.
not golden men and rainbows, and it's not everybody baking cookies. The period between 1800 and 1980 saw the worst mass killing in human history. So the idea that Aquarius is going to be in any way a wonderful time of human progress, yes, that was there too. But in between was horrific attacks on every culture. Just so many things that happened that were extremely dark. But you do also get the technological innovation. You get the steam engine. You get the development of flight. You get, going to the moon.
You get
crazy.
democracy too.
You get democracy in a different. Exactly.
Democracy.
That's right.
Yeah,
you get democracy. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a little bit before, but you're in that range where democracies flourished around that time, and prior to that, because it goes Capricorn and Aquarius, right? So Capricorn, I think it's part of the reason we're in a struggle right now, because Pluto and Capricorn tries to, in a way, it's the Trump thing of this fascist who wants to be in charge of everything. It's very Mussolini-like. It's got that quality of the Capricorn patriarch. I know, and you'll follow me. Aquarius is the sign of the people. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But doesn't that mean then, are you saying then that by this logic, now we're in the Pisces age?
Yes. Let's consider.
Cool.
Consider this. Let's consider we're now in a sub-period, and I want to go back to the last sub-period of Pisces at the end of the previous age to give you some warnings. So from 1980, according to this model, whether it's true or not, this is a symbolic map, right? We can make anything true or false. Let's play with it though. Let's talk about storytelling. So from 1980 on, we are going to be going through 180 years of Pisces sub-period in a Pisces period. Now, if you think about Pisces, right, 1980, a whole bunch of things happened in 1980 that we're going to talk about when we talk about this chart that I just brought up too. You have to look at these cyclical periods as cycles within cycles. We know that in 1982, you had Pluto, Saturn conjunct. And I'm going to tell everybody that if you're interested in cycle work, Dan Waits is a fantastic guy. He is really combing everything and writing great pieces. So find him. I'll give the link. And Patrick Watson, two people that really love history, and they're doing a lot of great work for all of astrology to try to match these. So 1982, you have the conjunction of Saturn and Pluto, which meet about every 38 years or so. At the same time, if you remember, that you get the first conjunction in air in 150 years in Libra, right? So you had Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto. A lot of things happened there that set the tone for what we're feeling and going through right now. One of them is Reagan being elected turned out to be one of the worst things that happened for a whole bunch of reasons. That when we lived it, we knew it, right? But a lot of people are like, oh, Reagan. Okay. The very fact, let's look at one Piscean thing, the fact that he took off all controls, right, off the media. So, you can basically say whatever you want. This is the Pisces mess that we've created, right, where you can get a Fox News literally lying to people about their own health, right? And getting away with it. That happened because Reagan loosened that particular rule so that people could do that, and especially in the United States, but then it spread everywhere. So we're kind of living in a Pisces. And by the way, it also, what Dan Waits did, which I thought was amazing, was that Saturn-Pluto conjunction was the first time that suicide bombings happened. Do you remember he talks about this? So you get the Saturn-Pluto, the first 1982. Now, what I want to explain to people about cycles, and I've got the 1892 conjunction of Neptune-Pluto up here. I'll explain why. When a cycle conjunction means, just like here, right, the two planets are meeting at the same space in the sky. But then what happens is those two planets keep meeting in a square, which is 90 degrees, or an opposition, which is 180 degrees, then the closing square, which is another 90 degrees, and then they start a new cycle. So what's really interesting about that Saturn-Pluto conjunction or meeting is that in the opening conjunction, you had the first suicide bombing, I believe he says it was in Lebanon. I will link the article because it's great. Then the second, in the square, you get the first attack on the World Trade Center, okay? Then in the opposition, you get the actual 9/11, right? And then, so you look at it and you're seeing how it's tracking. the same theme is coming up in a big way, right?
Right.
And then, of course, we got the same Saturn-Pluto conjunction happened in 2020, along with, everything else. And it kind of set this new reality we're in with COVID and a whole bunch of things that happened then. So you look at those cycles because they're cycles within cycles, right? Now, I want to go to the Pisces subperiod we're in now. If you go back to the previous Pisces subperiod under the Aries period, right? That would have been just before Christ, that 0 degree point. Rome was a republic. And I want to give this as a cautionary tale. It is actually the first time we're not talking about it was not progressive. It did not give women the vote. It didn't allow slaves to vote, but it was a republic. People had a chance to vote. In the period that closed that whole period over, like the Pisces as it closed, it turned into an empire, which meant that nobody had any choice. It was an emperor. And so I would think that people should be very careful in assuming that because you have a right, that right is going to be in your hands forever. I'm not saying we're going back to that period, but I'm just saying that as we are experiencing now, there's a lot of muddiness and a lot of taking for granted. Well, I don't have to think about this. I won't show up at the polls. We just had an election here in my own province of Ontario, which is a disgrace. I don't care who gets elected, but I do care who gets elected. But what I most care about is that the fact that nobody could get up to actually go vote. It was the lowest percentage of people voting ever. I mean, what kind of world are we in if people won't even take this seriously? So this is the sub-period that correlates to this one. Mm-hmm. But on the issue of cycles, which is why I'm so interested in it, 1892, you get the meeting of Neptune and Pluto at the same place in Gemini, okay? Mm-hmm. Famously, around this time, you get J.R.R. Tolkien being born, also Hitler, and a whole bunch of things. Step cycle. I know, interesting, two very different, disparate views of what the world is going to be. But what's interesting about it is that's a 500-year cycle. They will not meet again for 500 years. So every time these two are in sextile, or they're in any or square, they're going to be making a statement. But you have to go back to the original conjunction. Does that make sense? To figure out what was opening there and the depth psychology of flight, the first flights. Was happening there. So you're seeing something that's going to be repeated. So this is why I find
is that right?
Yeah.
First flights for Pluto Neptune?
It was either the first, Dan Waits talks about it, so I don't want to get that wrong, but he talks about how this is the first time that you get to conceptualize the model that will eventually happen in 1905 or whatever, but you get the first attempts. So it's in the air, so to speak, because remember, these cycles are not, Tarnas says, look, they're 15 degree cycles when it's mundane astrology. It's not, you don't take in 2 degrees because you're talking about world events, but it's what comes in the air, what you start thinking. Depth psychology, like I said, is an interesting Pluto Neptune, and Freud is part of this. By 1899, he'll publish his first work on dreams, the interpretation of the dreams. So you're getting a sense of what is coming, but then you track it, right? And you see, okay, what issues were there and how do they play out? And I thought that Dan Waits bringing in the Saturn-Pluto with the first suicide bombing, and then the first attack on the World Trade Center, and then 2001 and 2001 with 9/11, that's an incredible correlation of the same theme coming out in different ways, right? Mm-hmm. Oh, and by the way, the closing square on that Saturn-Pluto, that's when Osama bin Laden was murdered. Okay, was actually assassinated. So you get this incredible beginning, boom, boom, boom. And it's like this theme. And you could say, well, it wasn't just 9/11, because what evolved from 9/11 was incredible destruction in Iraq and Syria. And I mean, it had incredible repercussions for the world, right?
So how do you interpret, if you say the Pluto-Neptune cycle, right, they're now, Neptune is going to catch up to Pluto. So there's going to be a sextile in Aries to Aquarius, right? Is that right?
Right.
Yes, that's the next one. It's coming up. Is it the next decade, or we're kind of?
Yeah, it is. This is the Andre Barbeau's idea that we're entering a phase where you get there's some of the best planetary alignments of a century from about 2025 to about 2031. So we're actually one of the worst periods in the century. 2022 or 2021 was one of the worst low periods. So we're getting into a better period. So I would think that when you're looking at the sextile, whatever evolved from that 1890, and there's more, of course, there's so much that came. Remember that this is just shortly, in our last video, we talked about the death of God. Perhaps we have a reconceptualization of what the new God. And when I say the new God, people shouldn't think about suddenly there's a new religion. It's a new way to conceptualize the central authority that we have within, right? And so the reason I like Jung's work is he says it's all within. Eastern philosophy has always said this, so it's not a big shock to the Eastern mind, but to the West, it can be a bit of a shock, I guess, to some. So we may reconceptualize, maybe more work in the unconscious, psychedelics being, this is something you're already seeing through the Pisces age, being legalized so it can be used for therapeutic, who knows? But you want to look back to see what kind of themes were in the air, so to speak, because they tend to recur in different ways. And of course, the sextile is integrated. Yeah.
I have a fascinating, so I don't know, this might be wrong, but see, if you say Gemini, Pluto, Neptune, that's, in fact, that's flying. Gemini is like, Gemini is really the sign of birds, the idea of wings, flying. So, but they were sextile in the 50s, which is when a flight, the idea of taking transatlantic flights, flying everywhere, I think began to really become part of the collective, the world, literally.
Everybody does it. Yeah.
So now I wonder what that'll mean. I mean, probably some mundane thing where maybe they'll have, I don't know, they'll have places to sleep on airplane. I don't know, some
flying cars. Who knows? No, I mean, it's
exactly.
Who knows what you don't know. You can't conceptualize it. Here's another interesting thing Dan Waite's mentioned, which is a little bit more on the extreme side. The first time of talk of extraterrestrials happened during that Pluto-Neptune conjunction, and if you remember the 1950s, that was a huge time of people suddenly seeing crop circles, and and Jung looked at this and he said, you know what this means? This just means that when you don't have a central sort of metaphorical principle for God, you create a system that is always circular, because that's really the circle is the most perfect form, right? And so he thought that what people were seeing were projections of their own God image, right? But they were seeing it now in a new form, which of course so it'll be interesting to see, that recently they've started releasing all the information that that was kept hidden by the US government about these stories. So we'll see what evolves from there. I don't know. Personally, I have no belief in any extraterrestrial, although given how crazy the world is, anything could happen.
Yeah, anything is possible.
Anything is possible.
I mean, think about actual incarnate, someone, like how they show you on Star Trek, he's got different ears, whatever, whatever it is that, it's first of all, it's very connected to, whenever you see those things, they look sort of human, which already is a little strange. But the thing about it is that if you have an interest in the astronomy science, the distances are so staggering that it's hard to comprehend how that would work on that level. Yeah. But there may be, I mean, who knows? I talked with someone, I had these deep discussions with this person a while back, and their perception was that it's possible that our own race, the idea that in the future someone has come back to the past, and you're seeing people that are time traveling. The problem with that is that science says that you can travel to the future, but not to the past. Right. So again, you get a kind of a mishmash. But I agree with you. I mean, anything is possible.
Who knows? Anything is possible. I point to Neptune, and let's look at Tolkien. Tolkien created an imaginal world of Middle Earth, right? So what imaginal worlds are we going to be creating? I mean, you can play with this so many times, but what's really interesting is just to see those great cycles opening and closing, and then looking around. And then, by the way, I mean, for your work, because I'm much more just in the historical and mythological, it's really interesting when you see that in people's charts. Let's face it, Saturn-Pluto people, I mean, there is a vibe about the Saturn-Pluto person. It's difficult. It's a difficult aspect, right? All the people born in the early 1930s, and it can manifest as extreme paranoia. It can manifest as obsession. And so you start to see, well, okay, the 30s were a particularly dark time. So if someone's carrying that archetype with them, the period of time that reflects it can actually take you, and that's actually another thing Jung said, that you are both reflecting the period of time and carrying that. And so if you think about the chart as mapping that moment in time you're born, then it tells you a little bit about the personal journey as well, I think. Maybe I'm
Saturn-Pluto is really difficult because Pluto wants to destroy and recreate, and Saturn resists, because Saturn is the idea that you've created a structure. So you picture a person who is going to be, for whatever reason, and God knows, I mean, you can analyze that to death, but something in their psyche, I'm not pleased with this, I need to change it dramatically. but it's really them. But then they'll project it out and think, well, if I change the whole government, if I do something crazy to upend all the structures, that's why terrorism, 9/11 was Saturn opposite Pluto.
Yeah,
and
it.
The Saturn opposite Pluto period in the 60s, Virgo Pisces, was also really turbulent. There was a lot of social unrest because people were really unhappy with the existing structures. In reality, it's a lack of happiness with yourself, with your own psyche, but you project it outward, right? And then it can become really problematic.
Right. So I'm going to stop the show. That's the end of my little thing. But I thought it was really interesting, again, because I'm particularly interested and have been interested for so long in history, how these things map out and how they can really give you that personal or that insight into your own personal planets just by looking around and by saying, okay, what went down? And so that's, I think, why it's worth studying this, even though it is, it's dense. There's a lot of information, which is why, again, I really, really am thankful of the people who are doing this kind of work. They're sifting through archives, looking at the historical record, trying to see. And that's what, honestly, Richard Tarnas did, which is amazing, because it takes a lot of work. This isn't something you can just produce out of the top of your head. And again, let's close the circle by saying that is why I find it particularly difficult when I hear people like deGrasse Tyson kind of dismiss this whole area, this whole symbolic mapping without even knowing what it means and saying, well, it's all crazy. Again, it goes against their own history because that is part of their own history. But secondly, it just, we're talking about a symbolic universe, right? Which seems to have a correlation with actual things. There seems to be a quality that of the moment that matches whatever the map is. And I think that just creates huge questions. So instead of shutting them down and saying it's all silly, I think you might want to investigate, well, what could this mean? And what does it say about the way we've organized reality? Or what does reality mean? But then again, a lot of people are not really interested in these questions at all. So maybe I'm just going on my own now.
The thing is, though, that it's infuriating. The Neil deGrasse Tyson's infuriating because he's trying to discredit a system by talking about things that astrologers don't even bother with. He gets into there really are 13 signs. Like, well, what the hell is that about? What are you talking about? The idea with astrology is that you can map where the planets are. We have really good computers and ephemeris in this era, and you know where they are. And then you observe. And the way people have asked me, well, how do astrologers do this? Well, how do they know? Because over thousands of years, astrologers pass their knowledge on in writing generally, or in audio or in video, basically saying, hey, I observe this, and you start to get repetition, which is in a way the way science works. It's just that it's more slippery, of course, because it's not like taking 2 test tubes and saying, I mix this with this and it always turns blue and it always does whatever. No. But of course, that also is a realm that is more limited, because when you do the idea that 2 grams plus 3 grams of red and blue makes whatever, sure. And that's like saying, I figured out the universe and the value is 49, that Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the computer. Then what do you do with that? Astrology is really broad, but there's a definite system of rules and a definite environment you can study and feel. You can feel it operating in your psyche. It's definitely there. But, I'm glad to hear that despite the fact that we're in a Pisces sub-period, because that doesn't sound good at all, because that's a long one too, because that's 150 years. Good luck with that. But I'm happy that we're in a period that from Barbeau and some of these people that were the period we're in now. I remember looking at his cycles, Andre Barbeau, my namesake, and he worked this out, looking at cycles basically. And basically he said the peak of the no good situation we just crossed actually when Putin invades Ukraine, and then it starts to get better, and we go into at least a temporary period, which will maybe after that things will start to downtrend again. But there's a nice swath there where things improve.
A relief. That is between 2025 in my memory and about 2031. And that's because those outer planets, that distance that he calculated. So look, let's watch it. And of course, the other silly thing is you're never going to go through a period where there isn't going to be something, some altercation, some problem, right? But there are periods of time that seem less charged and less difficult. And so, you hope that for that, at least. But the idea that the Age of Aquarius, that song in the 60s, is going to bring light and is not understanding Aquarius, which like every archetype has its positive. Oh, by the way, let's never forget that Aquarius brings in its polarity, which is Leo, right? So with an Aquarius subperiod, if you think back to just remembered this, if you think about 1800 to 1980, you really start seeing the star, the apotheosis of the person who is a celebrity, who is the Leo archetype, carries the king, who's no longer there, but you have a whole bunch of other people that are carrying it for you. So it's very complex. And leaving it with this, it's multivalent. That's the word that I think Richard Tarnas uses over and over again. You can't nail this down. The way I was explaining it to my group is like, I feel like there's a wave, right, that we all participate in. And then there's the particle out of which emerges from the wave. That's your chart. So you've got all this stuff happening. And then in that moment in time, you've got this particle that appears and carries the qualities of that moment in time. And it's here to develop whatever it has to. And then eventually dissolves back to the wave, right? But one of the things I loved about the Sufis, and I like about what Jung said, is it is incumbent upon you as a particle in this moment in time to make the best of that experience and to become a little bit more self-aware, right? And I think we go back to what I always think about the astrological chart. It's just a map. It's not the actual territory. It's whatever you do with it. It can be lived out in a million different ways, but it's incumbent upon you to be as conscious as possible. And that is, I think, what a lot of people don't do the work in. And it's too bad because I think
that makes a lot of sense, because the logic, as I understand it, is that the chart is a map of what is possible, meaning those archetypes can manifest in really troublesome ways. I mean, when I said someone with Saturn-Pluto decides to blow up a building because they're unaware that they're really trying to change their own psyche, and they think, well, if I blow up that building, I'll feel better about myself. That's classic lack of awareness. Right. So any person can, through develop self-awareness, become aware of their own conflicts, their own strengths, their weaknesses. And it's the idea of being with all that and expressing it in more and more harmonious ways, where you're keeping all the forces, working in some kind of symphony, let's say, right? In contrast to when they're not doing that. And so that's the logic, which, by the way, as I believe Jung said, what you're not aware of, or what you don't discover within will find you outside. That's the classic thing that it's really the universe is mirroring it back to you. So then it should, in a sense, incentivize you, encourage you to do that call it inner work, but really it's just work. It's the work of self, or the work of awareness, or the work of life, to develop those principles so that, to put it bluntly, things can go better.
Right. Well, things do go better. But I do think at that point, it's a Saturn word. You have to take responsibility for a lot of your life. And I think for most people, it's easier just to blame it on somebody else, right? Anyway, I hope you find that interesting.
That was really interesting.
I find this work really fascinating. I really do. I could read about it forever. And I'm really encouraging people who are doing this work and will actually take the time, because you need all sorts of astrologers to do all sorts of things. And I think this has to be people who love history. If they don't love history, you're not going to sit and comb through each period, right? So when they do this work, they do it on all of our behalfs. And I thank them immensely for it.
That's great. Well,
okay, till next time.
Thank you. That was great.
I don't know what's next, but
I look forward to the next one. Yes.
Okay. Right. See you soon.
All
Bye.
Right.